In this video, we'll be talking all about clone stamp, healing, and spot healing brushes. Hi there, Michael Volshinovich here from Retouching Academy. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/retouchingacademy and also at retouchingacademy.com. So today we're going to be talking about some of the blemish removal tools that you may already have heard about. Those are going to be the clone stamp tool, the healing brush, and the spot healing brush. And we're not just going to talk about where they're useful, but we're also going to talk about the best ways to use them. Now, before we move on to actually demonstrating the tools, let's talk a little bit about how they work. So the clone stamp tool is really just a naive tool. All it does is it takes whatever source pixels you've sampled and it replaces the destination pixels with those source pixels. There's no interpretation there. It's not trying to blend anything. It just replaces the destination with the source. The healing brush is a little bit different in that it separates both your source and destination into high and low frequencies, with the high frequency containing your texture and the low frequency containing the color and luminosity values. It then tries to blend those two intelligently to create an effect that is, much more gradual and much more natural than it would be with perhaps just the clone stamp tool. The spot healing brush is a little bit different in that it doesn't use a source and destination. What it does is you just highlight the area you want to replace, and it will try to interpret what's around it and replace the destination with whatever it thinks is best. So let's go on to actually demonstrate some of these tools. If we zoom in here, the first thing we're going to start off with is the exciting task of fixing stray hairs. Now, one thing I always recommend whenever working with any of these tools is to work non-destructively. So we can do that in two ways. The most basic way is to just take whatever layer we have and duplicate it using Command or Control J. So that just essentially creates a copy of our layer and we can work on that layer. Now, I generally don't recommend that approach just because it takes up extra memory. So what we really want to do is just create a blank layer that we're going to do all of our retouching on. So let's just start off with a blank layer here. And one thing you have to always remember if you're working with this blank layer, if you're on the clone stamp tool, to make sure that when you're sampling current and below. If you sample just current layer, you won't essentially be doing anything because you'll be sampling from the transparent pixels in that active layer. If you're using the healing brush or the spot healing brush, so in the healing brush, again, it's the same thing, sample current and below. And in the healing brush, there's just one single checkbox, which is sample all layers. So that's going to take all of the layers. And there's no way to say current and below. So that's one thing to keep in mind is it's always going to take everything that is all of the layers that are within your actual image. So let's start off with the clone stamp tool. And essentially that is my go-to tool for fixing something like stray hairs here. So if we actually try and do this with spot healing brush, you're going to see that it's not going to work well. If we actually just go over this, it's really a disaster. It just doesn't look good, and you just have to keep going over and over again and trying to fix it, and you're just going to be here all day and never really get to the result you want. So for stray hairs, things like this, where essentially we don't want to interpret what's around it. We just want to take the background color and cover the hair with that background color. My go-to tool is the clone stamp tool for it. You can use the healing brush, and it tends to work relatively well if we just sample, again, using Option or Alt to sample, click down in the area we want to sample from, releasing, and then covering our area. As you can see, the healing brush doesn't do a bad job of that. The reason I don't like to use healing brush is that when I get into areas like this, it tends to get a little bit confused and try to interpret these areas and blend them together, and then you tend to get a little bit of softness and just creating pixels that you don't want. So for maximum control, and because we're not trying to blend any sort of textures together, we really just want to replace the whole hair with whatever the background is, I use the clone stamp tool. So grabbing the clone stamp tool, one thing that is very helpful when working with stray hairs like this is to use the correct blend mode. Now, one thing that I caution you about is when you're working on a separate layer like this, the blend modes that are for the actual clone stamp tool kind of go out the window. They don't really work well because what should happen is with lighten, if I go over and I sample using Option or Alt, and I go over here and then I kind of veer off to the side, I should never be creating this line here because we should only ever be lightening. But it doesn't really work correctly when it's on a separate layer like this. If we used it on the layer directly, it will work correctly. But the way around that is to just create separate layers for lightening, darkening, whatever blend modes we want, and just set it on the layer level. So if we set to lighten here, we see that that little blemish that we just made there will go away, and we don't really have to worry about that. So again, just finishing off, we're going to sample through here. Let's just get rid of this hair here completely. And you can sample, obviously you're going to want to sample as close as possible to the hair itself, because if you sample from far away, your color value may be different. And essentially you're just going to keep doing that for often what seems like an eternity when you have stray hairs. So that's the general idea there, and again, just use those blend modes to your advantage. If you had a blonde hair on a dark background, you'd use darken blend mode instead of lighten blend mode. Also, make sure to select the correct flow rate or opacity. For something like stray hairs, anything between 75 and 100% works well. When you're working on skin, so if I'm actually trying to use the clone stamp tool to fix something on the skin, I caution you to never use anything below like 60 or so percent, either opacity or flow, because what will happen is if you keep going over that area, eventually you'll destroy the skin texture and things will just not look great. So typically with skin, I will try to use the healing brush because it will try and retain texture no matter how many times I actually go over that area. And then I just stick to clone stamp tool when I have a very particular area that I want to precisely retouch, or if I'm working in the context of frequency separation, which we'll be covering in a future video. So let's look at some other spots that we may want to remove here. If we zoom into the eye here, and we try and remove this spot, this might be a good candidate for the healing brush. We can do that using the actual clone stamp tool as well. So we can do that just sampling and removing it. But as you can see here, when I try and sample this, it's really taking the wrong color, and now I have to kind of try and blend that color in, and it's just more work for me than I really want to do. So what I can do here is, let's just delete that layer. We're going to create another one, and we're going to pick our healing brush. So with healing brush, the process is the same. Use Option or Alt to sample, go over that area, and as you can see, it took care of the texture in that area, but it blended together the color and the luminosity values to give us something that is fairly smooth and progressive. Again, this doesn't work terribly well in areas of transition, so if I sampled from here and I wanted to go over this area, sometimes it fails, so you have to be kind of wary of that. Sometimes clone stamp tool is the best thing to use in areas like this, but in this case, it actually did a pretty decent job of it. Another thing that you'll want to use the clone stamp or the healing brush for is areas like this, where you have a line that you want to replace. So if I go over this, I sample from below, and I just go over, you can see that it does a pretty good job of blending all of that together. Now you always want to sample from above and below when you're doing a long line like this, otherwise you'll tend to get repeating patterns and they'll just not look very good and it'll look like an amateur job. So just make sure you always sample in short increments. So if we were to replace this particular line here, sample from here, go through a small area, sample from below, and so on, and just keep alternating like that. Now one thing I'll also caution you about with the healing brush is that whenever you're sampling, if I sample from here and I go across and then I try and go again, it will actually sample back from the original source. With clone stamp, what happens is if I'm sampling and I sample from here and I go across, my next point here will still sample from below. So it will always keep a reference to wherever my current mouse position is to the starting point that I had. Healing brush doesn't work that way. Now, as you can see with the spot heal or with the clone stamp tool, this didn't work terribly well. The healing brush did, again, a much better job of blending those tonalities together. Let's jump over to this image over here and we'll look at some cases where we can use healing brush and the spot healing brush for retouching standard blemishes. So going to this particular area over here, this might be a good candidate for the spot healing brush. So let's go ahead and grab that. Now with the spot healing brush, we have a couple of different options here. We have proximity match, create texture, and content aware. Proximity match, essentially what it's doing is it's trying to interpret everything that is around it, and it's going to try and take those pixels and, kind of find an in-between point to replace the area we don't want. Content aware is really doing the same thing, but it's doing it in a more intelligent manner in that it tries to interpret the content that it's working on, just the same as if you used content aware fill. So really all you're doing is you're making a selection around that and filling it with content aware fill. So let's start with proximity match. Let's go over that area there. And as you can see, that did a pretty good job. And actually, let me just take my own advice and work non-destructively here on a new layer. And again, I'm just going to go over that, and it's not doing too bad of a job of that. We can also do that if we step back using content aware, and let's see how it handles that. Again, not too bad. Where this would actually fail, if we go back to our previous layer here, and I actually try and use the spot healing brush and go over this portion here, if I go over this line, you can see it's just a disaster. Like, we've got a ton of softness over here because what it's trying to do is it's trying to take all these varying textures from all around and blend them together. And then, the rest of it, the actual result is just a soup of softness over here. So don't ever use it in situations where there's lots of texture that is varied around whatever area you're trying to replace. So going back into here, we've taken care of that area with spot healing. Something like this, again, we can take care of using the spot healing brush. And, don't be shy about going over that area multiple times. Unlike with the clone stamp tool, you're never going to really destroy texture because you're just going to kind of keep replacing it. So if the result is not what you want it to be at first, just try it multiple times. Something like this here is where we'd want to use the healing brush, because if we start to go over this using the spot healing brush, it's actually not doing too bad of a job this time, but really we don't want this light patch to be as light. We want to have a little bit more control on that, so that's something that I would probably defer to the healing brush for, and I'd separate it out into maybe this bottom portion here and the top portion and just handle those separately. Again, just making multiple passes is fine because we're not destroying texture using the healing brush. So that basically is it. The spot healing, again, just use it for minor blemishes in areas where skin texture is fairly consistent all around. Something like this is a perfect candidate. Healing brush, use it when you want a particular texture or area copied, so lines under the eyes work really well. Clone stamp tool, use it if you want maximum control. You don't want any sort of interpretation to happen. And also take advantage of the lighten and darken blend modes when you're using the clone stamp tool. So that's it for now. In a future video, we'll be covering the patch tool, which is quite similar. So to be sure you don't miss that, subscribe to the YouTube channel below, and also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/retouchingacademy. Bye for now.